There we go. Okay, so I'll just dive straight in. We've got two short passages, the end of chapter 15 from verses 36 to 41, and then chapter 16, verses 1 to 5. So in the first passage, Paul and Barnabas have an argument and go their separate ways. Paul heads out with Silas to Syria, and Barnabas goes to Cyprus with Mark. However, what I want to do is look at the second passage first, where Paul and Silas head off to Syria and what happens with that. So that's Acts 16, verses 1 to 5. So I'd like to invite somebody to read those 5 verses for us. Acts 16, 1 to 5.
Paul went first to Derbe and then to Lystra, where there was a young disciple named Timothy. His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was a Greek. Timothy was well thought of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium, so Paul wanted him to join them on their journey. In deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left, for everyone knew that his father was a Greek. Then they went from town to town, instructing the believers to follow the decisions made by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in their faith and grew larger every day.
Thanks, Steve. So off goes Paul with Silas. They meet Timothy, they take him along with them, and Paul circumcises him. Not a trivial undertaking, being circumcised as an adult, with little in the way of anesthetics available. In Genesis 34, there's the story of Shechem, who took Dinah, Jacob's daughter, and violated her. And the sons of Jacob said that he could not possibly take Dinah as his wife unless all the men of Shechem had been circumcised. So I'll read you 2 verses that explain that from Genesis 34, verses 24 and 25. All the men who went out of the city gate agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male in the city was circumcised. 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brother, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. So, 3 cheers for Timothy. That was quite a painful undertaking that he agreed to. And we kind of just read it through and think, oh yeah, but yeah, it hurt. This seems to be another one of those pragmatic wisdom decisions, kind of similar to James's announcement about not making it difficult for the Gentiles to come to faith. So to not make it difficult for the Jews in the area, because although Timothy's father was a Greek, his mother was a Jew. Now, if Timothy had been completely Greek, father and mother, like Titus, that wouldn't have happened. But this circumcision gave Timothy, who was considered to be a Jew, it gave him credibility in the eyes of the Jews, and things went well. Lots of good things happened from that travel. The churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. So a practical decision that seemed to have positive results. Just because you had a good result doesn't mean it was a good decision, but that's a different conversation to have. So any comments or thoughts you'd like to make on that short passage? Because I'm going to spend most of my time on the other part.
Well, it certainly does seem interesting, doesn't it, for Paul to make that his first instinct, let's make sure that Timothy is circumcised, since he speaks in very scathing terms of the circumcisers. He goes on to say in, is it Galatians, they should go and castrate themselves. So it's a very unusual thing for him to do.
Yeah.
he clearly is able to do it without it, I guess, cutting against, did I say it, his own understanding what the gospel really does mean.
Yeah.
He obviously thought it was quite a significant, it would have been quite a significant obstacle or impediment or an issue that would otherwise go away if they did this, such that it was worth it. Despite not really, despite believing or knowing that it actually wasn't needed in terms of being a Christian, it was still needed in terms of being able to reach the locals, I guess. So that was a context-sensitive thing.
It was.
As opposed to a normative teaching for us to follow, right?
It's kind of an according to the situation decision. You know, in a different situation, you might not have done that. If somebody else was in a similar situation, they may not have done that. But in this case, he did it.
It sounds like it was in response to what was for the believers at that time. You know, it was out of kind of care for them and wanting to free them by being able to not have anything that kind of got in the way.
Yeah.
I mean, because I think as well, like, because it's you mentioned about with that situation in Genesis, but I mean, because there was also when the main one was when the Jews crossed into the promised land, and then basically making them all kind of limited in their ability to fight, and then but basically doing it God's way, and you know it was but it was for God. It wasn't actually about the people they were going to attack, and it wasn't, you know, I'm sure in a way this again for Timothy was actually about between him and God as well. Like it wasn't just about, oh, this will make it easy for them. It was actually, yeah.
Yep. All right, I'm going to go on because sometimes we just need to sit on that. I think it's a story that is true, that is one that you can't easily sort of come to some general principles from and say, well, this is what we should always do in this situation. It was according to the context, the fact that they were traveling among Jews, and Timothy was thought to be a Jew and just made life easier in a sense. Yeah, okay, so moving on, and I'll now dig my screen up and just stick that on if I can. I want to put that on there. So you can probably still, can you see it okay?
Yep.
No. It didn't work, did it?
Yep.
That's all right.
Yep, that works.
It works? Okay, cool. So, another person, please, to read verses 6, oh, sorry, Acts, what have I got that up there for? I wanted to go to there. Acts 15, 36 to 41. Someone would read that, it'd be great.
Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in every town where we preach the word of the Lord, and let us find out how they are getting along." Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with him, but Paul did not think it was right to take him because he had not stayed with them to the end of their mission, but had turned back and left them in Pamphylia. There was a sharp argument, and they separated. Barnabas took Mark and sailed off for Cyprus, while Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the care of the Lord's grace, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches.
Thank you, David. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. So Paul said, let's go back and visit the believers. Barnabas agreed, although he wanted to take Mark, who was his cousin, with him, and Paul said, no way, Jose. A sharp disagreement followed, probably a gentle description on Luke's part. could have been a 3-page discussion if it was all explained, and then they went their separate ways. Now, it seems that God used this disagreement and good things came of it. And in the end, later on, Mark and Paul had a good working relationship. But as I mentioned earlier, that's a poor reason for saying that it was a good thing. It's, at best, it's an example of God working things for good, and it's certainly not normative or a principle that you could always come up with. So I've got 3 questions that I wanted to ask about this passage. There they are. You can see them. I'm going to put you in groups in a minute to have a discussion about it. Who is right in this situation? It's my first question. Then a slightly wider one. On what basis can it be said, or can we say that something is right? And then my third question is, what is or are our sources of rightness, of how we decide what is right? Okay, now you can discuss them all. You can just discuss one of them, or do one, nail that, and go on to the next. Okay. Any questions before I put you in groups? All right, let's see how I can do that then. What I'll do this time, I think, is I'll put you in breakout rooms and assign them manually so I kind of mix them up better. So how many people have we got? 11, so about 3 rooms would probably work quite well. Let's see how we go. So room 1, I'll put okay. Do you want to come and sit with me? Righto. Yep, I'll do that one. That's one room. Room 2, I'll put Greg, Steve. Philip, sign, and room 3. Sorry, it's just taken me a wee while to do this. Okay. Room 2. All right, let's see if that works. You can join your rooms and discuss those 3 questions, and I'll make a note to what they are. I'll give you 10 minutes to have a talk about that. They're not anywhere yet. Oh. Okay. Done that. So, okay. Recording, and I'll just ask each of the 3 groups to make any comments or bring any questions that they had from that, and then we'll move on.
What interested me was Judy said that this is earlier on in Paul's life, and maybe he was more what's the word, impetuous and more jump to a decision than he did later in his life. He might have been a little more lenient and thought about it and not so rushed into it and being so bullheaded about it, I suppose is the word.
So did that make it wrong?
No.
It made it understandable.
Yeah.
Personality and all that thing, those things.
Yeah, yeah.
So to some extent, you know, if you look at the approach, perhaps the decision was consistent with their personality or mission or sort of style. You know, if you know, Paul is, you know, going to conquer the world, and he needs people that are fully committed and not going to slow him down and aren't half-hearted, right? Whereas if Barnabas is being a bit more pastoral, then looks like Mark needs someone to pastor him, you know.
That sounds
you know?
like an argument and for saying that both of them are right.
Yeah.
Mm.
They were probably acting consistent with their personality.
Is that
So
how we
is that-
measure rightness?
It's a way.
Just being annoying.
Yeah.
Like you
I
said,
don't know what-
it's not always one or the other, is it? It's not always, well, that's right and that's wrong.
It's not.
Sometimes that's understandable is actually enough.
Mm.
We went the other direction in terms of that neither was right, but based on the fact that that it was kind of, to get to that level of anger and stuff, there was would have had to have been a lot of mistrust, and that actually that didn't represent what was on their hearts for each other, and you know, so neither of them was right, but we did. It was good talking about the fact that then they were on their journeys, because they were involving God on their journeys. Then he was able to bring good out of it, even though, you know, that had all happened. He was able to bring it for what was right for him, and that really it's God that's the source of rightness, not us. Like we'll always be fallible humans, and that's also what it shows, is that those, even though they were disciples, it kind of shows that they weren't suddenly spiritually perfect men. Like they were still human with human faults, and they still needed to rely on God, because on their own, just fight and bicker.
I'm intrigued here as to where this John Mark comes from, because we go further back in the chapter, the apostles and elders send their greetings and wrote a letter, and they said, we want you to send messages. They'll go with our dear friends Barnabas and Paul. We send to you Judas and Silas. And then further down, Judas and Silas, who were prophets. But we don't know mention of Judas here. We suddenly have Barnabas said, I want to take John Mark. So he come out of the blue, as it were.
Yeah.
So you could understand where that might upset Paul, because even the elders that said, we're sending Silas and Mark, we don't hear any Silas and Judas, and unless Judas is John Mark, I can't see, you know, where he fits in.
Yeah, well, maybe they didn't follow the instructions the elders gave them either, or agreed upon.
Another comment in our group was that it was good that they got the disagreement out of the way before they set out, because it could have caused more problems down the road.
Or they could have got it together and learned to get on.
Oh,
Better.
there's an idea.
But in actual fact, they now have a double blessing, because there's two lots of messengers going out in two different directions.
Dangerous argument though, David. You know. But yeah, I mean, God can work those things in all sorts of ways. Just any other thoughts, questions?
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about, Jenny Cameron was making a good case that it is important who you're working with. In some situations, some scenarios, you need to be able to really trust the people you're with. And it could well have been that case for Paul, thinking about the places they've been and the trials they faced. Not only is it a known quantity that Mark couldn't hack it, or at least he turned back for some reason, and that might have weakened the team. But there's also just the reality that we are humans, and who we get on with when you're at close quarters and under great stress makes a big difference. And it's not unreasonable for Paul to say, well, I don't want to go there again with Mark. Nor is it for Barnabas, who's the son of encouragement, unreasonable to say, but I want to give a guy another shot.
Yeah.
So they in their own way, in a sense, it's not like they are making unreasonable or unright observations or desires. They both want a good thing. And arguing over a good thing probably isn't a bad thing. Probably not having any debate at all might be worse than being able to have a sharp disagreement.
Yeah, good. All right, with that, thank you, everyone. I'm going to share my screen again. I think share. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, cool. All right, so I'll move on. I just wanted to give a little minor reflection on doing what is right, because it came out of that. And so here are a few thoughts on this. We can do what's right, and we should. Sometimes it's not so clear. Sometimes people will not agree with us, but we should endeavor to do what is right. However, it's possible to do what's right with the wrong intention. And so an example of that would be in Luke 18:10, when the Pharisee and the tax collector went up to the temple to pray, and the Pharisee went up to boast about what a great guy he was, and the tax collector went up to humble himself before God. So they both did the right thing, to go to the temple and pray, which is, thumbs up. But they had different intentions, and one of them had a wrong intention. So it kind of didn't make it right anymore. And sometimes, and you touched on this already, you can do what's right in the wrong way. So for example, in Ephesians 4:15, Paul encourages them to, among other things, to speak the truth in love. So if you speak the truth and it's not done in a loving way, is it still right? Well, there's got to be at least a question mark there. And so for some people who are very focused on doing what is right, you don't always bring these ideas of intention and the way in which you do something into it, because they all go together and make up the picture. Intention is, sometimes you don't even know your own intention, but doing right is more than just getting it right. It's the intention you bring and the way in which or how you go about it as well. So I put it like this: if you make a decision, if you have time to think about these things, and sometimes we're just thrown in the middle, you say, what will I do? Why will I do it? How will I do it? And then you could add in, who will I become if I do this? And so I'm trying to just enlarge the idea of thinking about what's right. It's not just what I do, it's my intention, it's the way I do it, and the consequence is that if I do it, this thing in this way with this intention, what sort of person am I becoming? Because that will follow from it. So if we ask Paul, if we go back to Paul and say, how did Paul fare? Did he do right? Did he have the right intention? Did he do it in the right way? I could ask that of Barnabas too, to be fair. I'm inclined to say that he didn't really do it in the right way, and you've touched on that. but they both had good reasons for what they were doing. One was to encourage a young man who had potential, and the other one was to get an important job done without being hindered. So in some ways, they could be both right. Okay, so I've just tried to widen the idea of rightness, because I find sometimes when people who, we can easily take a narrow view of right. And the story from last week and the story of the circumcision, there's a lot of things going on in there that you can't just say, well, that's right, that's wrong. It's a little more complicated, perhaps. Any comments, thoughts before I go on and say one more thing about this?
I think that's pretty helpful.
But I'll take that. Okay. The source of our rightness. Just wanted to add something on that as well. Some people say that we know what is right based on scripture and God's commands. And that's kind of right, but it is not as right as I used to think it was. And so I'll just wander through that. So, for example, just a few examples in scripture. Love others, said Jesus, as I have told you. Well, that's not what he said, is it? How does it go?
As I have loved you.
I have loved you. Ephesians 4:3, forgive others as God has told you. Not so. He said, forgive others as God has forgiven you. Another command, really. As you have sent me into the world, Jesus prayed, so I send you. Or an Old Testament example in Deuteronomy. This is in the every 7 years when the slaves were set free. He said God spoke to the people through Moses and said, be generous, as I, the Lord, have been generous to you. And Paul himself, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And all of those things point us towards an imitative faith, where the commands are based on God's character. The rightness is based on being like God, not just keeping his commands. It goes beyond the rightness of it. And so people that focus greatly on rightly dividing the word of truth are looking at the commands and trying to keep the commands. And we should keep the commands. I mean, that's a given, I think. But deeper under this, the rightness comes from, are we being like God in the way, or the example of Jesus in the way we do things? You know, that love others as I have loved you, that's easy to remember, but what does it mean? You know, and it's so much easier to have a command, you know, you can work with that. Forgive others as God has forgiven you. And so I think there's a big argument that our source of rightness is the character of God, more, not only, but more than, we should give more attention to the character of God than we do to the commands of God. Because a lot of the commands are actually character-based.
The key word there is as, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's in all of them, almost. Yeah, it's in all of them. Yeah, hadn't noticed that. So we we are to imitate Christ, not just, and I mean, yes, we keep his commands, but his commands, some of the commands to us are imitative, to be like me. Quite interesting. Right. Okay. So our source of rightness is from God's character rather than, or certainly more than, God's commands. I'm not disagree. I mean, God's commands are still God's commands. But keeping rules doesn't change us, doesn't deal with our intentions and various other things. So I'll probably digress just a bit there. So anyway, I have one more thing to kind of that's come out of this little incident, and that is to ask this question: what do we do with disagreements? When you really disagree with somebody, a fellow believer, what do you do with that? Especially when you're right. Yeah. What do you do?
Which we always are.
That's why we have disagreements. And how do you deal with it? And so I'm a bit. I've got one. I have one thing that I've made a little bit of progress with this that I'll share. It's kind of a value that I'm working on, that where I say I don't always need to have my own way. You know, I can be discussing something with someone and I'm sure I'm right, but I just sometimes let it go. Sometimes I don't. But that's one thing that's helped me to kind of, it's not chickening out on something. It's just, this probably isn't important enough. Some things are, but yeah. Any thoughts that you've had on, when we have disagreements, what do we do with it? What works? Because we'll get them. It's part of living together in community.
I think it does depend on what it is and situations, but I think partly it's knowing whether it's really important to God. Sometimes it's kind of like, is this really something that is God concerned about this, or is it just me? And then is it really that important to argue about?
Yeah, for me, for me, it's important for me to understand from the person's own story how they came to their conclusion, or else I will begin to disrespect them if I don't understand their journey, and I have to then, and it's real for them, and so that gives me a different sense of the person rather than it being about the thing. So that's important for me to stop me feeling as though I have come to a conclusion on a journey that, everyone comes to conclusions from different journeys. Yeah.
More recently, I've found myself, if I've got really racked up about something or something's got me surprised by how much it's affected me or impacted me or angered me or something, so try and figure out why is that? Because why do I feel annoyed? Is it because, is it an injustice thing, or is it that, do I just not like being shown to be different, or, was there really
wrong?
It's like, why is it? And if I can figure out why I'm suddenly feeling so animated about something, sometimes it's more helpful to then answer, to sort of shed light on the actual problem, or highlight or eliminate things, or focus on the actual issue, not how I feel.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I agree with that. I find that happens with me a lot. And Rob asked me that question too. He's like, what, like, where's this coming from? And sometimes we don't like what we find out either, because you can feel a bit fickle or silly, or sometimes it just makes you feel a bit vulnerable because you think, oh, I didn't really know I felt like this. But I find when I have strong feelings about things, there's usually a reason. And it's good to know that before you go any further.
Yeah.
I think you need to know what yourself first. I mean, it doesn't work perfectly, right? Because things get messy.
They do.
And sometimes you have to undo what you've done. If you've spoken in a harsh way or whatever, or not listened. But that can all be sorted out. I think, knowing yourself is a big part of that.
Which is why we have each other as well, to be able to talk about things and know where we're coming from, which
I don't always
often
know.
we won't know on our own.
I don't always know with me straight away. Yeah.
There are certainly times I hope that I'm going to be found to be wrong. To think something and to believe in something is not always to actually believe or think something that is good, that you actually want to be true. And there are times I find myself in disagreement with someone and actually wishing and hoping they're right. It's not always easy to cross that line, but there are things when people, I might interpret a situation and think that what's the reason for that, I guess they'd be troubling if they were true. And if someone sees it differently and they say, well, I thought this, and I say, well, I hope you're right. I don't see it that way, and I get to see the evidence. And maybe there's plenty of evidence, maybe, and again, perhaps related to the story of John and Barnabas and Paul and Barnabas. Paul has a good reason to be unsure, but Barnabas might have good reason. And in the end, it's proven to be right about John Mark's character. He writes a gospel, for crying out loud. Not a bad guy to have around.
It's a funny thing because sorry, do you on mute?
No.
Oh, sorry. He's got the control. But yeah, like we often talk about, or we've been talking a bit in our house about, we sometimes say there's plenty of reasons, but what's your reason?
What's the real reason?
What's the real reason for you? So we can all use evidence and things about what we think, and we can say we know someone or a situation, or we know the outcome of something based on evidence, but actually we all have our own motivations in things, and we are like, it's harder sometimes to admit what that thing is for us, like what's pushing us with something, because we might have a range of other stuff that looks really good or seems true, but often the real reason for something is quite simple, but might be a bit uncomfortable if you're in a disagreement with someone. What you're worried about, what you're concerned about, what you think is important. So it can make you feel uncomfortable. Anyway, that's what I find lately is something we've been talking about from time. Like, there's all the reasons, but what's the reason? Why are you saying this, or what's going on?
Yeah, well, we will have disagreements, and they can be valuable. It just it requires wisdom, again, to push something a bit further, to let it go, and still maintain a relationship, And it seems that Paul and Barnabas did have a relationship. It didn't disappear on them, and I mean that's a good result at the end. So yeah, kind of a messy wander through the passage, just some things to ponder and think about. Yeah,
I think the thing is also is knowing that that we all have the Spirit in us, and so so I think we don't know what the Spirit is touching on, is doing in any of us. Like, we don't know what's going on there, but so it's just that point where, like, so that doesn't mean we don't have disagreements or we don't want to talk about stuff, but I think that's where we can trust, because we can trust God in the situations. And again, it doesn't mean that you don't have disagreements or we don't have arguments or things like that, but I think there's there's a difference when it gets to the point of mistrust, which is basically saying we don't trust that someone's going to follow their heart, or that they can, really tune into what God feels. And I feel like that's where,
Although there are people that we don't trust, you got to work with that too. I mean, certainly people that not in such a close relationship as you and Pip, but some people you're sure, but you still got to work it out. You still got to make some progress. Anyway, I think disagreements will happen. And if I had to say anything, I would say we have to be broad-minded about when we decide if someone or something is right or not. There's a few things going on there that we need to give consideration to.
I think it's what the situation is also, what was the right decision right at that point would have been quite a different one later on.
Yeah.
The picture that we see later on, they've all moved on quite a bit, matured quite a bit, and their journey's been, they've learnt stuff, right? And different things became important. Or more important.
That's an argument for reflection and evaluation as well, instead of just leaving it. I mean, you could be doing too much of that as well, but just to reflect back and say, now, okay, how did that go? What did I learn? Stuff like that, useful. All right, there we go. Thank you for your participation. Let me ask somebody to close in prayer, and then I'll turn recording off, and if we want to chat a little bit, we can. Otherwise, that will be all. So I ask someone to close in prayer, please.
Lord, we thank you for the time we could spend together, and how amazing it is that an hour can go by so quickly. The gift we have of the oneness of spirit, even though we are separated and apart, nevertheless you keep us close. And Lord, we thank you for John's reflection and what he has led us through tonight. And we ask that it be a blessing to us, and we ask that you bless our little church and our little part of the world, and the people that you have given to us to influence, who are not just here but are all over the place. In Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.